about then if you thought you'd had some sort of vision, maybe you weren't sure, and you're very comfortably established in Bristol, and a voice sort of said, I want you to leave everything and come with me to not a city or a village or a town or even a county, but a land. But I'm not going to tell you where it is, because that's what Abraham was called upon to respond to, isn't it? And we don't know what kind of background he'd had. We don't know what kind of response might be expected from Abraham at that point, do we? Not really, because we understand from Joshua 24 that there had been idol worship back in his father's time, maybe extending even to his time. And I suppose the truth of it is, we don't really know. We don't know at what time Abraham, maybe his father too, at some stage, started to serve the God who, in whatever way it might have been, appeared to him. But we know that he did. I, as you do, been tapping things into the dreaded instrument on the desk when I've not got much to do at work, and for the last few weeks I've been tapping in occasional references to Abraham, and I think, oh yes. And I suddenly went back to one point that came up on the screen, and I thought, I'm not sure about that, but it's good if it's true. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to mention it. And I'm just sitting there and thinking, yes, I will. You see, it just came up on the screen. The first Hebrew in the land of Canaan was Abram. So, yes. And that was BC 1948. The first Hebrew to be granted a right to the land in AD time was in AD 1948. And I thought, what about Christ being born 4 years BC or 6 years BC or 2 years? I'm not sure. They didn't make anything of it, these commentators commenting on the life of Abraham on my screen, didn't make anything of it at all. It was just the dates came up and they moved on. But I just thought, 1948, 1948. So I thought, I'll set you your homework at the beginning. Is it true? And please don't spend the next 30 minutes or so working it out, because there are a few more things you might like to add to this. There are some lovely things that come out of the life of Abraham, and almost all of them point forward, don't they, to the gospel in Jesus. Galatians 3 we could have read, of course. Abraham started the gospel in a sense, didn't he? God says, I preached the gospel to him. He's the very basis of the gospel. Everything that came through the gospel record to us depends on God agreeing with Abraham to do what he did ultimately do with Abraham. And I use that word quite advisedly. It was ultimately, wasn't it? Ultimately. Abraham waited a long time for God to actually allow him to have a son through his wife Sarah. And it may be, not that he'd given up hope, I'm sure neither of them had given up hope, but it may be that he'd begun to think that God maybe intended him to do it in a different way. But we'll come to that in a few minutes. That's a sort of staging post that I'm hoping to arrive at soon. For the moment, let's open our Bibles at Genesis, chapter 12, of course, and we'll go in to the life of Abraham here. We're not really starting in Ur of the Chaldees, as the chapter from Stephen's defense reminded us. God appeared to him in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia, but we're picking up the story here in Haran, aren't we really? Because the Lord had said to Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house. I know he took his dad with him. In fact, if you read the record in the previous chapter, it almost appears as though Terah, Abraham's father, took him. Don't know what you make of that. Not sure what I make of that. But whatever we make of it, Abraham's faith is unsurpassed and undoubted. But Terah went with him, and also Lot. But there will come a point when Lot must needs depart, and Abram be left in the land with his family. But here is the promise I referred to at the start, verse 2. I'll make of thee a great nation. I'll bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken, and Lot went with him. 75 years old was he when he departed out of Haran. So there it is, whatever we might have done, whatever we might think we might have done in the same circumstances here in Bristol or Bournemouth today, Abram just went. That's what the implication is. Abram departed. He just went as the Lord had told him. God knew his man, didn't he? God knew his man. He always does. And verse 5, a little hint here of God's care. We've sung about that in hymn 116. Thank you for that. Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they'd gathered, and the souls that they'd gotten in Haran, and they went to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So, wait a minute, he left everything behind, but suddenly he's gained great substance again. That's God blessing him. He had the confidence to leave things behind, and now God's blessing him again. All the substance. Well, Brother Harry Whittaker says he'd had 5 years to do that. I don't know if you've read Harry's book on Abraham. It's good. It's enlightening. It just gets behind the story a bit, as Harry so often does. 5 years in Haran. You need 5 years in Haran to get 430 years to the self-same day, incidentally, from when he left Ur of the Chaldees to when they went through the Red Sea. The years of their sojourning. Paul tells us about that, of course, in Galatians. And God had warned Abraham that there would be a long period. All right. What does Abram do? Abram, verse 6, Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh. The Canaanite was then in the land, and the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. God, of course, hadn't promised him a land yet, had he? And he still isn't actually promising him a land now. The primary purpose of the promise was to the seed. It's to the seed I'm going to give the land, God said. Oh, you'll live in it one day, Abram, and you'll share it. But the primary gift is to your seed. And you don't need me to go more deeply into that, do you? Except just to point it out perhaps as we go by. And the Lord appeared unto Abram then and said, your seed will have this land. And Abram removed from there, having builded an altar. And he goes to a mountain east of Bethel. It wasn't named Bethel then, so we may say it perhaps wasn't actually recorded until after the life of Jacob, which fits in with what most of us believe anyway, doesn't it? Because that's the time when Luz became Bethel. And he pitched his tent, Ai on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord, and journeyed on, going ever southward. But just pause at Bethel a moment. In this house of God, as it was to become, Abraham built an altar and called himself by the name of the Lord. You get a similar reference to that earlier in Genesis, when man began to call themselves by the name of the Lord, as the correct interpretation seems to be. He called himself by the name of the Lord. It's sort of like the right hand of fellowship, isn't it? Welcome, brother. You know, he came into the truth, as it were, in the house of God at Bethel. He responded in his own mind now with all the acceptance that he could muster to the things that God had promised him. and then he journeyed on. In a sense, it was perhaps a pity that he journeyed on, wasn't it? In a sense, because there was a famine in the land, and Abraham journeyed a little too far, didn't he? He went down into Egypt. Little byline here, because some of our publications show the future layout of the land actually to enclose much of the land of Egypt. The parallel sectors that Ezekiel sets out, if that is a literal interpretation of what the land will be like in the kingdom, some have actually interpreted it running right down to the Nile because of the reference to the river. But there is a river higher up than that, just at the very south of the land of Canaan as we know it. And I don't think that God ever promised Abraham any part of Egypt. This was a big mistake. He should never have gone into Egypt. It wasn't that God wouldn't bless him whilst he was there, because God continually blesses this man because of who he was and what he was. Later he would say of his son Ishmael, I will bless him, Abraham, if you want me to, because you want me to. Because he's your son. That's why I'll bless him. That's what God thought of Abraham. That man Ishmael wasn't in my plans, but you gave birth, you gave conception to him, Abraham, so I'll put him in the picture and I'll bless him because of my regard for you. Isn't that lovely? Lovely testimony to this man. But here he is doing the wrong thing. He's in Egypt. And so he says, you're a fair woman, Sarah. Quite elderly lady now. Had youth begun to come on her a little? Is that what was necessary for the child to be born? Or was the growing and aging process sort of slower in those days? I'm not sure. Whatever it was, Abraham was concerned. And he said in verse 12, it shall come to pass when the Egyptians see thee, they'll say, this is his wife, and they'll kill me, but they'll save thee alive. It's just that little humanity, isn't it? And it's no good saying we would probably have done differently, because we probably wouldn't, would we? But look what he says. He says, say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake. My soul shall live because of thee. That's an unusual little phrase, isn't it, really? My soul shall live because of thee. Brother Alan Siviter of Dudley, I remember him saying, because I made a note of it at the time, and it impressed me. He said, there's more to this, you know, than just the fact that if Sarah got on all right with the palace and they didn't believe she was Abraham's wife, Abraham's life would be saved. He's looking beyond that. And I think Brother Alan's right. My soul shall live because of thee. We've got a purpose that God has laid upon us. It's essential that we live. We've got to live, Sarah. There has to be life. He didn't know about Macpela yet, but there's life beyond Macpela, as Brother Alan said. And you know, that's true, isn't it? That's true. This man was looking at the big picture. He wanted God's promise fulfilled in him. I'm sure it wasn't the importance of whether he lived or died literally there and then at that time, so far as he was concerned, but it mattered that he should live because God had made a promise that depended upon him living. And he says, Sarah, we've got to see that it's all right. We've come this far. We can't let them kill us now. And, well, you know the story. And you read on thinking, God will condemn him for this, you know. Not a word. Not a word. He condemned Pharaoh. He plagued Pharaoh and his house because of Sarah. I call her Sarah, but she'll become Sarah, won't she? Abraham's wife. He never said a word to Abraham. Do you think Abraham prayed for forgiveness? I think he did. Because those are the circumstances in which God wouldn't condemn him. And look what happened. I'll tell you what happened at first on the way here. Did you miss that word famine in the land? I missed it for years. If he went ever south trying to find pasture for all the animals that he'd obtained in Haran, what sort of condition in a land of famine and dearth were they going to be in when he got to Egypt? Not very good. So once again, he's a man with nothing. And look, he's going to be a man with great substance again. Because God's going to do it again. Verse 16, he entreated Abram well for Sarah's sake, and he had sheep and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels. He hadn't had many of those before, but he had now. He's better off now than he was before, having done the wrong thing. He'd prayed for forgiveness, hadn't he? As David prayed for forgiveness in the Psalms much later, in wonderful words about a completely different issue. And the wealth of the Gentiles. In anticipation of Isaiah 60 and Haggai 2, come into the family of this man. It's going to happen again. The wealth of the Gentiles is going to come into the family of this man. We're waiting, we're going to see it happen. It will happen. I'll read Isaiah 60, read Haggai 2. And Pharaoh, very upset, isn't he? And perhaps rightly so. Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her to me, to wife. And she's your wife. Now go take her and go on your way. And Pharaoh commanded his men and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. A man of great wealth and great substance again. And where's he going to go? It's the little things that sometimes we miss as we go through, or apparently little things. Where's he going to go? Hasn't settled anywhere yet, has he? Well, in a sense he has. Verse 1 of next chapter, 13. Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot went with him up into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south to Bethel. He's not now wandering around the land having a look at it. God would tell him to do that later. Go east, west, north, south. Come on, Abram, walk through the land. Look at it. I'm going to give it you and you see it. He'd already journeyed through it. He isn't going on with that same journey, looking at more sections of the land. He's going back to where he came from. Going back to Bethel. Now, why is he doing that? You're ahead of me, aren't you? He went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning. And in case you don't know, God says where that was, I'll remind you, it's between Bethel and Hai. It's verse 8 of the previous chapter. Unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. He did it all over again. He went back to the place where he had come into the truth. And he did it all again, didn't he? What do we do every Sunday when we can? When we can. As oft as you meet, do this in remembrance of me. What has God provided that all those of us who have come to him, named ourselves with the name that is bestowed upon the Lord Jesus Christ, can do when through the week we've done all the sort of things that Abraham did here in going to Egypt. We can come back again to where we started and say, Lord, thank you for Jesus. And remember in the way he appointed all that was done. He went, as it were, back to the meeting, didn't he? He went back. It's a lovely picture of a man who's making a point, and of God, the divine inspirer here, who is making the same point at the beginning, which he'd made there at the first, unto the place of the altar. God can't stress it strongly enough. When you wander away from the things you should be thinking about and the things you should be doing and the faith you should be showing, Go back to your brothers and sisters in the church. Go back to where I put you in the first place. Forsake not, as it were, for later times, the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is. These are lovely pictures. And I'm aware it's 8:15 and we haven't got to any of the big pictures yet, have we? Not really, not yet. We go a bit further. Well, we go quite a lot further, if you'll bear with me, but I am aware of time. Don't promise you we're not going to overdo it, but there are some lovely pictures to look at. Now, before we get on to one of the two of the ones that you're probably waiting for, let's just stay in chapter 13 a little bit longer, because God still must be aware of the fact that this man Lot is with Abraham. This relative after the flesh, and he's going to get him into trouble again in the next chapter, actually. But he's here, and Abraham says to Lot in verse 8, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen." And I love this gentle hint here. Lot, we're brethren, aren't we? We're family. We're family. You don't have strife in families, do you? We're family, Lot. Lot, let's make a decision that'll end all this strife. And I'm sure this is a test, you know. Verse 9, the whole land's before you. Separate yourself from me. Do you think he really wanted that? Separate yourself from me. With everything that God had promised to this man, and all the blessings that were to come on all the families of the earth, surely it must include his own. Separate yourself from Abraham? You wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do that. Why would Lot want to do that? Oh, but he did. He did. He had a righteous soul that was vexed, but he was a weak man. Thankfully, God puts it here for us to learn by it, that he's able to forgive, and he's able to look on the things that are good in us, and sometimes we have to live with the consequences of things that he's forgiven, as Lot was later to live with the consequences of things he should never have done. But God's record of him was that he was a righteous man. We don't forget that, do we? Righteous soul that was vexed, but he couldn't somehow get it right. And so, well, you know what happened. Ooh, lovely cities, lovely land. Ooh, desert that way. You know which way he went. Lot was the man for the easy course, wasn't he? But you see, it wasn't until he'd gone. It wasn't until Abraham was completely alone that God could say to him, "You walk through all this land, Abraham. You think you've just given some of it to your relative. I'm not signing the deed over, Abraham. You walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, because I'm going to give it to your seed." It's still the seed. See it there, verse 15? It's still the seed. Abraham, you might think you can control where it goes and who it goes to. You can't. It's going to your seed. Not the ones that are going to be born in the near future directly. There's one in the future, though, through whom all the promises are going to be fulfilled. It's going to go to him. You might think you've given a bit to Lot. Don't worry. He's given you the desert, Abraham. You'll have it all. And he could have said, when a man called Isaiah comes along, in his 35th chapter of his record, he'll tell you just what it's going to be like in the future. Beautiful. All of it. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it. I'll give it unto thee. And he built another altar unto the Lord. That's a third one, actually. He built another altar unto the Lord. Now, that takes us to chapter 14, doesn't it? And we could spend the whole evening talking about Abraham and Melchizedek, couldn't we? We'll spend a few minutes because you can't go past Melchizedek, can you? You just can't. I'm assuming you all know what this chapter's about in its substance. It's about an invasion of the land, as a result of which Abraham's natural family are very involved and taken away from the land that God would one day allow them to dwell in. And you might think, haven't I read of something like that happening in the future? Of course you have. You've read of something like that happening in the future. You've read the Olivet prophecies. You've read Zechariah 14. You've read Psalm 83. You've read Ezekiel 30. You've read it all. The invasion from the north that comes into the land and removes Abraham's family from the land that God would give them. But God has a man in mind who will go and rescue them. We read of Abraham here. We're thinking Jesus, aren't we? We're thinking Jesus. One or two gems, just as we go through. Verse 14, you know Lot's been taken. When Abraham heard, father of heights, incidentally, Abraham means, when this man heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan, and divided himself against them. He and his servants by night smote them, pursued them to Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus, and brought back all the goods, and brought again his brother Lot and his goods. He got more wealth. God's pouring it on him, isn't he? He doesn't want this. He doesn't want this. This is representative of a man going forth in God's name to rescue people. God's people, God's natural people, and to bring them back and to present them to the king priest. Oh, I know the picture sort of is two ways, but that's what this is, isn't it? How many men do you think went? 318? I mean, I know some Gentiles went with him, it says at the end of the chapter. How many men went with Abraham? Now, 4 kings with 5, wasn't it? 4 kings with 5. Huge invasion. And all these trained armies lost the battle, lost the war. And Abraham goes out with a handful of men. Come on, you might say. Come on. What hopes he got? Hopes he got? Well, God always works on odds that won't work, doesn't he? Whether it's Elijah on the mountain or Gideon with his 300 men, the odds there were 430 to 1 in both cases. God won. Of course he did. But 318 fascinated me a little bit, because if I talk to you about numerical values, will you all go glazed? Don't glaze over if you don't understand. Val will probably explain at the end, because she's heard me say this a million times probably. 318. Haven't got any new, numbers in the Hebrew language. They're all letters. And you've got to decide from the text whether you should be adding them up or reading them. And I'm being serious there. That's what I mean by numerical value. If it were English, A would mean 1, B would mean 2, and C would mean 3. Do you want an A or do you want a 1? We'll look at the context. Oh, we need an A there. Oh, well, we need a 2 there. I won't complicate that anymore. Just accept to say that 318 doesn't have to mean 318. It could be a set of letters instead. It could be. The translators had to decide. They had to decide whether it was letters or numbers, as they did with the whole text. And they decided Abraham went with 318 people who were actually born in his own house. Now that's a lot of people to have been born in his own house, considering he left everybody behind when he was 75. He had 5 years in Haran. He's now come into the land. It's not a lot of years for 318 people to be born, considering at the current time he still only has one wife who's had no children. And he lost all his servants at one stage, gained new ones, it's true, in chapter 12, wasn't it? But 318? What if we make it into letters? What if we say, well, wait a minute, it might not be 318. It might be that we're meant to read it as in the letters. What would that read? Oh, Eliezer. Eliezer. That's the word with the numerical value of 318. So just read it again. Verse 14 again. When Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servant, born in his own house, Eliezer, and pursued them to Dan. Wouldn't be a greater miracle, would it? 318 or 2, it's still a miracle. But isn't it just a little bit interesting that Eliezer, my God is help, the man who was born in Abraham's house and was his heir at that time, actually went with him and brought all these wonderful people back, Abraham's family. I don't know whether that's how it should be read. I just see the difficulties, well, all right, with both ways. And I'm not unaware that he took the Gentiles with him. I think that's lovely. When the man sent by God goes in the name of my God is help, as it were, to fetch back the family that have been taken at the invasion from the north and to present them in a king-priest situation, there are Gentiles with him. It's just interesting, isn't it? Let's not go any further than that. It's just interesting. It makes us stop and think a little. And that won't do us any harm. Even if we've got it wrong, it won't do us any harm, will it? And they come back then, and there's two kings. Two kings waiting. King of Sodom and Melchizedek. Now the king of Sodom thinks he's probably got a bit of power here, because he says to Abraham, I can give you all this wealth. And Abraham says, no you can't. It's true, isn't it? Abraham says, no you can't. I'm doing king of Sodom first, although actually Abraham spoke to him second. Verse 22. Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I've lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. I will not take a thread or a shoe latchet. I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I made Abraham rich. Not a woman's hair tie, not a shoelace. Nothing. You can't give me anything, king of Sodom. And if you think you could give me some land, you couldn't give me any land. You could give me nothing. God's given me so much, he'll give me more. But you can give me nothing. Now, bear in mind the other king is standing close by. The other king is standing close by. What's he got to offer? Nothing like the wealth that Sodom has to offer. Verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High God. He brought forth bread and wine. Now we must better see something in that, mustn't we? And the fact that Abraham chose it. Have you got a bookmark? Because if so, just stick it in there a moment. Although we can get back to Genesis, I'm sure. But let's go to Hebrews 7. I daren't tell you I was told I could go on till 9 o'clock. I'd better not, but Hebrews 7. I don't think we should leave this. We've got the man Melchizedek with bread and wine, and he's going to bless Abraham. And truly, the lesser is blessed of the greater. All right? Let's just see what Paul says about it. I think it was Paul. It may have been Paul. Peter says that Paul wrote a difficult letter, hard to be understood to the Hebrews. This may have been it. We don't know. But whoever it was, we need this. Verse 1, Hebrews 7. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abram returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abram gave 1/10 part of all, first being, now don't miss this, by interpretation, King of righteousness, and after that King of Salem, which is King of peace. So the writer to the Hebrews is saying, when you read Genesis 14, interpret it. Look below the surface. You're not just looking at a man with bread and wine talking to Abraham. Interpret it. There's an interpretation in these things. This is laid down in the scriptures as a foreshadowing of something greater. It's a type. Read it and interpret it, says the writer. How do we interpret it? Well, verse 3. You're seeing a man about whom you know nothing. No father, no mother, no descent, no beginning of days, no end of life. He says, I haven't told you anything about him. This man, Melchizedek, I've told you nothing about him. And he appears once more in the Psalms, and then here, and that's it. We don't know anything about him. And yet this man who wrote the Hebrews thinks this is the best illustration of the priesthood of Jesus Christ that he could possibly use. And that's because we don't know who his father was or who his progeny were. It's because of that. You see, Aaron's family, their priesthood depended on who their father was. It wasn't depending on whether they were going to be a good priest. It depended on who their dad was. And God says, my priest will not be chosen on that basis. I'm not telling you anything about this man, and I'm putting him in the scriptures in order that right at the beginning in Genesis you might know that my priest is a man who stands because I have selected him as my priest, not because of who his father was or who he may give birth or conception to. It doesn't stop there though, does he? It doesn't stop there. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God. You can't have it better than that, can you? You can't have it better than that. God says, read Genesis 14, interpret it, and see there Jesus Christ in his priesthood. Better than better, isn't it? That's what it's all about. And he emphasises this, actually. It's a pity sometimes that the translators, certainly in the AB, which I love, put the commas and full stops where they do, because as with the thief on the cross, occasionally they get it wrong. And I'd venture to suggest they've got it wrong here. Verse 5, verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted, from them receive tithes of Abraham. He whose descent is not counted, receive tithes from the sons of Levi, because their great whatever grandfather paid them. See, Levi, in effect, God makes arrangements so that Levi's forefather pays tithes to Melchizedek in order that we might always know that the Melchizedek priesthood is greater than the Levitical one. And God says again, as I've just emphasised, he whose descent is not counted is the man whom God chose to represent a greater priesthood than Levi. And he backs it up again in this way, and without all contradiction, he says the less is blessed of the greater. All right, we go back. Abraham's now somewhere up here, isn't he? He's on a high like he could never obtain in any other way. Oh dear. No, he's not. No, he's not. It's a bit like Elijah, isn't it? You know, 430 prophets slain. The rain coming pouring down from heaven at his prayer. Jezebel says, I'll kill you tomorrow, Elijah, and he runs for his life. We're all human. And here's Abram, bit depressed in chapter 15, a bit depressed. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, fear not, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. And Abraham said, well, Lord God, what will you give me? I go childless. Steward of my house is Eliezer. And Abraham said, you haven't given me any seed. And one born in my house is my heir. And the word of the Lord came to him, no, Abraham, Eliezer's not going to be your heir. And incidentally, look out for the man Eliezer as you go through, because I don't think we're going to get to him again before time's up. Look out for the man who could have had everything and said, no, I'll do it God's way, it's got to go to Isaac. What a man. We'll meet him in the kingdom. And verse 4, as we say, he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And then he brought him forth abroad and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. Oh. Come out the tent, out into the field. Look at the sky, Abram. See all those stars? And he could have said, should have said, no, Lord, I can't see stars in the daylight. Verse 12 tells us that it's hours before the sun goes down. I can't see stars in the daylight. Look, it's a Mediterranean sky. It's blue everywhere. Not a star in sight. Abraham, can you see those stars? Yes, Lord. I can see those stars. They're there. They're there. Yeah, well, that's like your seed, Abraham. That's like your seed. Do you believe that I'm going to give you a seed in the future? Millions of them, like the stars that you can't see. The seed you can't see. But do you believe it, Abraham? Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Verse 6. He believed the Lord. If you be able to number them, so shall thy seed be. And he counted it to him for righteousness. He counted it to him for righteousness. God can do that, does do that. Abraham, I know you can't see any up there, but I know you know they're there. Now, can you look on my promise like that? Can you really look on my promise like that? Can you look at something you can't see yet and know that in my purpose they're as good as alive? And Abraham says, yes, Lord, yes, yes, I can. No wonder he gets this marvellous covenant promise at the end of this chapter. Oh, what a man. And it's all going to go wrong again. Well, of course, he's human. We know it's all going to go wrong again. Because Sarah says, it's been a long while, Abraham. We've lived in this land for 10 years. I wonder if God means you to marry my maid. And then if she gives birth, because I own her, she's a slave from Egypt. Oh, so we know one thing that came out of Egypt, don't we? That time. She's a slave from Egypt. I own her. And if she gives birth to a child, and of course he's your child, then God will grant all the promises and we'll have a child. And it'll be a boy. I know it'll be a boy, she'll say. She was trying, wasn't she? She was trying. But she'd got it all wrong. And when Ishmael comes along, apart from the fact that God names him along with Isaac, John, Jesus, I think they're the only four, aren't they? Isaac, Ishmael, John, Jesus. They're the ones God names. But God never says, but Abraham, don't talk to him about the promises. You've got to wait a bit longer yet. Doesn't say a word. Not a word. And for 10 or 11 years, this boy goes to Sunday school with Abraham and learns about the promises, doesn't he? Of course he does. I know Abraham. He shall teach his children and his household after him. I know him, God says. So you know he taught him. Ishmael, God's made wonderful promises, and they're all going to happen through a child of mine, and you're my only child. They're going to go through. And God never said a word. Not a word. You see, that's sometimes how it is, isn't it? And, you know, there came a time when God came to Abraham. We'll glance at it, verse 21. Chapter 21, sorry, verse 1. You see, this is God's action. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. I don't remember God saying anything about that year or that month or that day, do you? But you see, as with the stars, it was set in stone for God, and he did it exactly when he intended. Poor Abraham. He hadn't waited, you see. Don't condemn him. He hadn't waited, but he tried. He tried so hard to do it God's way. But somehow he couldn't. Are you still in 21? Just real sideline really, but verse 17, this is the second time Hagar's gone away. First time she came back, but this time she stays away. She's in awful trouble. Amongst the fathers in distress, of whom we sung and of whose care by God we sung at the beginning, God heard the voice of the lad. Isn't that lovely? Chapter 21, verse 17. Just to show you that God had brought him up in the truth, you see. It wasn't Hagar, his Egyptian mum, who was praying for help, even though she got help and was the first woman ever to see an angel. I think it's the first appearance of an angel, isn't it? In the whole of the scriptures. Comes to this woman. And God heard the voice of the lad. He's praying. Ishmael's a lad who prays. Marvellous, isn't it? This is Abraham's family. And he's bringing them up as God knew that he would. And when you come, don't go there, but when you come to Isaiah 60, and it says the rams of Nebaioth shall come up with acceptance on my altar. In the kingdom, Nebaioth is this man's son, Ishmael's son. You see, at the very end, some of Abraham's family, not Israel, are going to come back and be in the truth, in the kingdom truth at the time. Lovely links with the names sometimes as they reappear in the scriptures. All right, I'll perhaps just tell you a couple of things rather than take you through them. You probably already realise that God could have circumcised Abraham at any time in all those years when he called him out of Ur of the Chaldees, but he didn't. And yet by the time you come to chapters 15 and 16, it's all about the covenant of circumcision, isn't it? So why not earlier? Why wait all this time? Well, I'll tell you why I think he had to wait all this time to get this wonderful covenant. 16 and 17. I think Ishmael forever afterwards needed to be known as the son of an uncircumcised father, whereas Isaac must not be the son of an uncircumcised father. I mean, what do you think of that? I don't know. But you see, God had waited years to give him a covenant he fully intended to give him. Believed, incidentally, before this, of course. The covenant was sealed. But Ishmael was the son of an uncircumcised father. And whatever they might say in the future, or whatever they might lay claim to, the descendants of Ishmael, in the future, whatever might be going on in the land, like it is today, they could never say that they were the son of the circumcised Abraham, because they were not. But the Jews are. Does that make sense? I don't know. And the removal of the flesh had to come before the seed of promise appears. And you can take that forward and it grows, doesn't it, as you get to the New Testament. Romans 4, I've got a link there myself. The removal of the flesh had to come before the seed of promise. It could never be misunderstood to be Ishmael. Not if they read it properly. It could never be misunderstood to be Ishmael. Ishmael, oh Lord, if only you could bless him. He is my son. Well, I will, God says. I will. Verse 21 of chapter 17, I will. But my covenant, not circumcision, they both had that. My covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah will bear to you at the set time. Next year. It's coming. The set time. I knew when he was coming, Abraham. Wish you'd trusted me. But you're a wonderful man of faith. You can imagine God's thinking on these issues, can't you? Well, let's begin to round off, shall we? Chapter 22. The only begotten Son. Hebrews 11 verse 17 says of this. He took his only begotten Son. Find me another place outside of the Lord Jesus Christ where a man is described in that way. And you can't. Because there isn't another time in the whole of Scriptures, with the exception of the Lord Jesus Christ. Hebrews 11 says, when you read this chapter, just like 14 and Melchizedek and Jesus, when you read this chapter, you're reading about the only one whom the Bible refers to as the only begotten Son. The only one. So we know this is about Jesus. It's all about Jesus, isn't it? We know that. All right. Verse 2. And we've got another little gem, haven't we? Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest. January the 1st through to round about, David would tell me, but round about January the 15th, something like that. We're reading these chapters, aren't we? You haven't read the word love, though.
It's read on January the 11th.
Wow, quicker than I thought. Yeah, thank you, David. January the 11th. Well, there you are. 11 days. We've been reading them in the new year, and we never hit on the word love once. But it's here.
No, sorry, 12. Sorry, 12 January.
Okay.
Yeah.
Less than 2 weeks anyway. Thank you. Right. First reference. Never miss it. First reference in the Scriptures. Always. Priesthood, same thing. Redemption, same thing. Always encompasses the whole picture of what God means by it. So here's a father taking his only begotten son, who was born by miraculous means, and he's going to give him for the promises. You see, all the confidence in the promises is going to depend on what Abraham believes now, isn't it? You know the story, and you could go through it yourselves, couldn't you? I mean, verse 4, the third day. It had to be the third day, didn't it? Third day. It could have been the first or the second or the fifth or the sixth. No, it couldn't. God started the journey in such a way that they would arrive, or rather leave, the place of sacrifice after 3 days and 3 nights. You can't miss it, can you? It's amazing. Verse 6. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took the fire and the knife. And Isaac said, I can see all these things, but we haven't got a lamb. And Abraham comes up with the most wonderful reply. Whatever could he say? He said, God will provide one. You can't have it better. The Genesis of the gospel, I'd say it is. The whole gospel's in Genesis, isn't it? The beginning of the gospel. It's all here in Genesis. And you know what happens now? The promise becomes unconditional. You read the promises through for yourselves and you'll see for yourselves. Up until this time, it's, if you do this, Abraham, I'll do this. But once death, and Hebrews tells us that this is true, once death was not perceived by Abraham to be a barrier to God's promises, promises are unconditional. Now, as good as done. Abraham, you believed. They're yours. They're yours. Once death was seen to be no barrier. Raise the life to kill the boy, and when he did, the promises died. No, he believed that God could raise him from the dead, from whence also received him in a figure. What's the difference? Abraham, man of faith. Oh, wow, I'd say so. And they came, both of them together. I love these terms that come in Abraham's life. They journeyed, both of them together. And then you've lost Isaac. He's gone. He's gone. Do you know when you meet him again, this man who was laid on the altar and came forth again, resurrected in the mind of Abraham the father, resurrected. Do you know when you meet him again, God keeps him on one side until chapter 24, and you meet him at his marriage feast. Oh, it had to be, didn't it? Spoil the whole picture if he appeared in between. He appeared in chapter 24 at his marriage feast. And there's Eliezer. I didn't think we'd get there. We nearly didn't. There's Eliezer, praying that what Abraham wanted would be done. Praying. And before he had finished praying, Rebecca appears. God sees him on his way, and he says, that man will be asking me to provide this girl that he's come hopefully to find. I'll make arrangements. We'll bring him this way, and she'll leave her father about then, and she'll get there. They'll get there just about that time, just as he's asking for her, and there she is. Because that's how God works. He does. I know, like Abraham, we lose sight of it sometimes, but he does. And time has gone. Valuable gifts, jewels, all bestowed on her, you know. Purchased, Peter uses as a word about brides associated with the only begotten son. Purchased to be my wife. And they say to her, will you go with this man? And they're not talking about Eliezer, you know. Look, this man who's come wants you to go and marry a man you haven't met yet. Will you do it, Rebecca? And the same question has hung over us at our baptism, didn't it? Are you going to go with this man? Are you going to become engaged to this man? Are you going to set in motion a contract whereby one day you'll be a bride to this man who you haven't seen yet? And like Rebecca, we've got to say, yes, please. And when the bridegroom saw the bride coming, do you know what he did? He took her into his tent. No, he didn't. He took her to his mom's tent. Why did he do that? Why was it still there? Sarah died. Why did he do that? Well, you've got to read the Song of Solomon 2, and in time now. Took her to his mother's tent. And the Song of Solomon 2 says, figuratively speaking, that's where we all go. We go to where the promises rest. The promises that came into being, whereby by becoming the bride of this man, we have hope. And that's it, isn't it, really, brethren and sisters? We can't get any further than the marriage supper of the Lamb. Isaac and Rebekah, a real love story. A man with only one wife, all the others had more. God didn't condemn that. But the picture is true. The only begotten Son, the man with one bride, and by God's grace, he wants us to be part of that bride.